Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Sonic Interactions pre-concert talk. I'm so glad to see so many of you here. It's wonderful that you've come all the way to Liverpool Hope to see this event. I'd like to introduce James Andine, who will be giving the pre-concert talk about Saariaho's piece, Petals. James is from De Montfort University. Here he is. And we also have Jonathan Asgard, who will be performing Petals tonight. So I'll invite him here today on the stage, and he'll be demonstrating a few of the techniques throughout this pre-concert talk. Thank you.
All right, hi everybody. Thank you very much, Manuela, and thanks to everybody for coming. Now, let's do a quick test. If I speak like this, does everybody hear me, or is the microphone really much better? Much better with the microphone. Very good, much better with the microphone. Very good. All right, well, so yes, Manuela has very kindly invited me to come here tonight, in part to perform the electronics part of Kaija Saariaho's piece Petals with Jonathan on the cello, and has also kindly invited me to give a short presentation now before the concert about the piece, and specifically about the live electronics part. So what that means, what are live electronics, and some details about how they're deployed in this particular piece. So Petals, Kaija Saariaho is a Finnish composer. Petals is a piece of hers from 1988. It's a very interesting piece. It's a very formative piece. It's also a very representative piece of a very particular period of electroacoustic music, of a very particular category, which we'll talk about a little bit. Now, one of the things that's interesting about Petals is it's based on material from one of her previous works, Nymphaea, from 1987, which is a work for string quartet and electronics. And this piece, Petals, takes up more or less exactly where Nymphaea ends. So the opening cello passages of Petals starts with the ending cello passages of the earlier work, Nymphaea. Which I think is very charming, it's very poetic. And maybe there's a clue to that. Nymphaea means water lilies, so I think there's a clue to that in the names of the works. So Petals then being a close-up, zooming into the material of the earlier work, maybe. So we're interested right now a little bit in the live electronics aspect of it, so we should talk about that and how they fit into the work and how that fits into the development of the idea of live electronics. So Petals is an example of what's sometimes called mixed music, and sometimes also referred to as live electronic music. And what this means is simply that it is a combination of a live acoustic instrument plus electronic resources of some kind. Now, the electronic resources part of that equation can take a number of forms as far as the broader genre is concerned. So this can mean, for example, that there's a tape part that has been prepared in the studio and that's played back during the concert with the live instruments performing a kind of duet with the tape part. Or it can mean that there's a number of samples, which again have been prepared beforehand in the studio and that are triggered live during the concert. So again, we end up with a duet situation between live acoustic instruments and these pre-prepared samples. Sometimes there are electronic tools that act as instruments in their own right. So that can be electronic circuits, that can be a feedback performance, and yet again, a duet then between the acoustic instruments and the electronics part. But what we have in Petals is something different. Petals is an example of a very different approach to mixed music, to live electronic music. It's a situation in which, rather than presenting something in contrast with the acoustic instrument, the electronics are used to process the acoustic instrument. It's a question of live processing of the acoustic performer, of the instrumental performer, as they perform. So these live electronics now are more of an extension of the acoustic performer rather than in duet or in contrast with the acoustic performer. A microphone picks up the live sound of the cello, in this case, in the case of Petals, which is processed in a couple of ways, and the processed sound is heard over the loudspeakers. So instead of a duet, the separation between the cello and the electronics is deliberately obscured, deliberately covered up, so that instead of having two instruments, you end up with one extended instrument. So Petals, in a way, isn't so much a work for cello plus electronics. It's a work for extended cello, for a super cello or a hyper cello, sometimes called extended instrument or hyper instrument, this kind of approach to working with live electronics. It gives us a cello that does much more than a cello on its own can typically do, that extends its range, extends its capabilities. So we'll talk a little bit about how this works specifically in Petals. So in Petals, the electronics part involves primarily two layers of electronic processing of the cello part. And that's reverberation and harmonizer. So we'll talk a little bit about what those mean and what they're doing in the work. But before we talk about that, I think it's important to remember that there's a significant layer of the electronics before we even get to the processing in this piece. And that's the simple fact of the amplification of the cello. So an amplified cello already behaves differently than a cello on its own would behave. The act of amplifying the cello, so putting a microphone quite close to the instrument, amplifying it, making the sound louder, and playing that back over the loudspeakers in the hall, that's going to bring us a very different sounding instrument than a cello on its own. It's going to allow us to hear aspects of the instrument that normally out there in the hall you wouldn't be able to hear. Aspects of the instrument that under normal circumstances would only be audible very, very close to the instrument. If your ear was where these microphones are, you would obviously hear different qualities of the sound than you can hear all the way out here. So this includes, for example, some of the detailed timbral elements of the sound, especially of the quieter sounds that normally don't survive their voyage out into the hall. And also some of the details of the texture, of the grit of the texture of the cellist's performance that, again, isn't normally audible acoustically in the hall. So these things are, in a way, they're returned back to the performance by virtue of simply amplifying the cello to begin with. But we might be a little more interested now in thinking about the processing that happens in this piece. So as I said, that's reverberation on the one hand and harmonizer on the other hand. So reverberation, I suspect many of us are at least vaguely familiar with the idea of reverberation and what that does. But reverberation gives an effect not unlike, especially as it's used in this piece, not unlike the use of the sustain pedal on the piano. So it makes some of these, in this case, in Petals, it makes some of the slower passages easier to sustain. The notes hold longer and they linger in the room past the point that the performer has stopped producing the note. One of the interesting parameters in Petals is a change in the length of the reverberation time used over the course of the piece. So it starts with quite a short reverberation time, and then this gets longer as the piece progresses. So by the end of the piece, it's quite a long reverberation time. So that means that the music lingers much longer in the room by the end of the piece than at the beginning. But it also gives the impression that maybe we're in a much larger space, that we're hearing the piece in a larger space at the end than we were at the beginning. Or that we're listening to a much larger cello, a much larger instrument at the end of the piece than the one we were listening to at the beginning. And that's a very interesting kind of transformation that isn't possible really without the use of the electronics. Next we have the use of the harmonizer effect, which comes in and out over the course of the piece and which acts by detuning the pitch of the cello. So the harmonizer in this piece, it adds two copies of the cello sound back on top of the cello sound. One of them tuned 1/4 tone up, and the other tuned 1/4 tone down. But rather than having this sound more like there's, as though there were 3 cellos in the room, this in fact just sounds like there's one much thicker, much bigger, again, cello than the simple acoustic cello. So together, the combination of the reverberation and the harmonizer, they extend the instrument, they extend the cello in time and in space. The cello becomes larger than life, and the longer reverb times quite literally stretch the cello out, making it larger in time and duration, but also in space and in scale. Now, an interesting aspect of Petals is that these effects aren't created by the electronics alone. To some extent, the extended performance techniques that are written into the score also work towards these effects. So, for example, the movement in the piece between harmonics and noise-based textures, as performed by the cello, and the constant upward glissandi that seem to disappear into the upper registers, they also serve to give some of this sense of expansion and extension of the instrument. Those aspects of the work, these extended techniques, they're embedded in a broader strategy in the instrumental writing here. There's a move away from the traditional priorities of tonal composition, of pitch and harmony and rhythm, which are sort of the cornerstones of tonal composition and tonal music, towards the priorities that are more commonly found in much contemporary writing, which here is primarily texture, gesture, and timbre. So away from pitch, harmony, and rhythm towards texture, gesture, and timbre instead. To some extent, some of these are almost direct replacements or extensions maybe of the earlier priorities. So rhythm becomes gesture, and harmony becomes timbre, and so on, as we move away from tonal music techniques and move towards contemporary music techniques. And in Saariaho's case, especially in a piece like this, some of this is wrapped up with influences from the genre of spectral music, a 20th century genre that came out of France later in the century. So it's the interplay and combination between Saariaho's extended instrumental techniques and the electronic extension of the instrument that really makes this particular piece special, these aspects working together in tandem to create some of these impressions. It's all of these elements working together that create our extended instrument or our hypercello. So the extended performance techniques, which are extended and work together with the amplification, which is extended and works together with the reverberation and the harmonizer effects. Now, Petals is considered a classic of this kind of writing, and in part this is because it comes at a very particular moment in the development of mixed music or live electronic music, of music for the concert hall that combines instruments and electronic resources. A lot of the earlier work with this sort of context focused on the combination of live instruments with a pre-recorded tape part, which we mentioned earlier. So a tape part that is fully composed and prepared in the studio, then bringing, at the time, a reel-to-reel tape recorder into the concert hall. You press play, and the live instrumentalist performs in duet with the tape part as it runs. And there's a lot to be said for this version of mixed music, of live electronic music. For example, it allows the composer the opportunity to develop a much more complex and detailed electronics part than they might be able to produce live, with a significant degree of precision also. And it's very reliable, very importantly. It is easy to play it back in the concert hall with not so much probability of things going wrong or of equipment breaking down or so on. But it also has significant limitations. And prime among these is that the prepared tape isn't responsive. It runs along on its own exactly the same every single time that you press play, every concert, every night, every concert hall. It doesn't care what the performer is doing. There's no way for it to respond to a particular moment, to play a bit faster or to play a bit slower, or to respond or react to the many small variations in the live instrumentalist's performance from one performance to the next. It's very fixed, it's invariable, and it's unresponsive. Now, live electronics or live processing such as is used in Petals offers a solution to that problem. By processing the live instrument rather than preparing the electronics beforehand in the studio. Every detail of the cellist performance is fully reflected in the live electronic part. No two glissandi are exactly the same, so when we hear the reverberation and the harmonization during Petals, it is exactly this glissando that we are hearing with every variation of that particular moment included. What's more, the live processing follows the cellist. The cellist is free to play faster or slower as they wish, knowing that the electronics part will follow along with them, rather than being a slave to the locked tempo that's already recorded on any pre-recorded tape. And in fact, the relationship is even more subtle than this. It isn't simply that the electronics follow the cellist, but also that they can each engage with the other. So the electronics will follow the cellist, but equally the cellist can follow and respond to the electronics. So for example, the cellist might extend a phrase or a passage according to how the electronic reverberation sounds in the particular hall on that particular night, or might take a longer pause before starting the next phrase to let the reverberation of the previous passage finish up, and so on. So now it's a two-way relationship. It's very interlinked, with the electronics responding to the instrumentalist and the instrumentalist responding to the electronics, so cooperating together to produce a collaborative performance. Now, if this is the case, then why not always compose like this? For example, why didn't previous composers who were just starting to explore this idea of instrument and electronics in concert performance focus primarily on this kind of live processing? Well, the answer lies in the development of the technology involved. When the idea of electronic music for the concert hall was first being explored, the technology either simply didn't exist or else was so cumbersome and laborious to physically get into the concert hall, that, or so unstable and unreliable once you did get it in, as to be somewhat prohibitive. Hence the earlier emphasis on more reliable forms like instrumentalist plus pre-recorded tape. In earlier days, for example, one of the main ways of doing live processing of a live performer was by bringing a reel-to-reel tape player into the concert hall, or more likely several tape players, and using these to do the live processing. So for example, to deliver tape delay effects, or by recording the instrumentalist as they go and treating them and then playing this back as the performance proceeds. There were other live processing tools available as well, such as, for example, filters, electronic filter circuits that again could be brought into the concert hall and used live. But some of these kinds of circuits or hardware offered quite limited performance potential, especially considering the effort required to get them in and get them working. So once again, composers might choose instead to employ the expanded palette that was available working in the studio, pre-recording it, and bringing that in, even though this meant losing some of the responsiveness and spontaneity of live performance as a result. But things began to open up quite dramatically, for example, in the mid-1980s with the introduction of digital tools for sound processing. For now, what would once have required quite a large and unwieldy stage setup now simply required bringing a small black box onto the concert stage to do your processing for you. So immediately much more practical, much more accessible, and also much more reliable. And what's more, the kinds of processing that these new digital hardware tools could offer were much more elaborate than what had been possible or available earlier. So Petals, again, offers an excellent example of this. Even the relatively simple processing that we will hear in Petals tonight, reverberation and harmonization, nothing more complex than that, would have been a much more imposing technical production for onstage performance prior to the introduction of these new digital tools. So although some of this kind of composition would have been possible earlier, there was a real explosion of this kind of work in the mid and late 1980s as the technology becomes much more accessible, much more reliable, and much easier to use on stage during a concert. So works like Petals are quite groundbreaking as a result. These compositions from this generation of live electronics using the live digital processing of the instrumental performers. Saariaho had the opportunity to really explore this territory more openly and flexibly than would have been possible before. And so we get works like this one that really explore the compositional potential of these new scenarios, of this idea of hyper instruments and extended instruments, and which through this develop a new musical vocabulary in this period in the mid and late 1980s. So it was a very exciting time, and Kaija Saariaho was right in the thick of it. She was doing work at IRCAM in Paris, which was a leading location for this kind of work at the time, generally in collaboration with her husband, Jean-Baptiste Barrière, to develop the electronics in a series of works, a number of them for cello, a number of them also for voice and electronics, which have become, as a result, classics of this genre and this period. Now, it's worth pointing out that this technology didn't freeze in 1988. It's continued to develop. So tools for live processing on stage have again become more accessible and much, much more powerful than they were 20 or 30 years ago now. This particular piece was originally written for a black box, for a piece of hardware called the Yamaha SPX 90. Nowadays, it's commonly replaced by software models, in this case written in the Max MSP visual coding language that models the reverberation and the harmonizer effects that were delivered originally by the SPX 90. And this means that instead of having to track down the correct hardware, as you would have had to do in the past, now you just bring your laptop with you on stage and hook it up, and you are ready to go. And what's more, it's true of all of Saariaho's works. So bringing your laptop on stage means you can, from any laptop, perform her entire electronic oeuvre from the same software with no more effort required than that, which is pretty remarkable. In fact, most of her pieces retain the seeds of her processing, and most of her pieces are already contained in earlier works like Petals. So these very long reverberation times come back again and again in many of her works, as well as sometimes the harmonizer, but also sometimes with more complex spatialization procedures being delivered by the software, which aren't involved here in Petals. So in fact, what I think might be worth doing is maybe a quick demonstration of the basic techniques. So if Jonathan would like to play any gesture just on the cello, and we can hear what the unamplified cello sounds like in the room. Great. So that's the cello sound as we are maybe used to it. Although, even that said, this is already a form of writing for the cello that's maybe different than what we might expect in the 19th century. But let's hear the same passage amplified, if we may. So no effects applied yet, but and no extended techniques really either, but I'd still propose that the amplified cello is already an instrument with a very different character once it's amplified and played back over the loudspeakers. At the very least, it's a much larger instrument than it was without. Let's try the same thing with, we'll put on one of the longer reverberation times, and let's try that with the reverberation on it. All right, so as described, we can hear that at least resonating in the room for much longer. It's lingering for much longer. That's quite an exaggerated degree of the effect that we really only hear at the end of the piece. So I've sort of spoiled the climax for you already, but I'm sure you'll forgive me. And that's quite dramatically different. To some extent, that sounds like multiple cellos, because Jonathan becomes a time traveler. He's layered with himself from 3 seconds ago, plus from 5 seconds ago, etc. So it's much more drawn out, much somewhat larger than life, let's say. Let's try adding the harmonizer effect. So as I said, this adds 2 copies of the cello, one a quarter tone higher and one a quarter tone lower. So as I think as we heard there, this is now, well, you can decide for yourselves whether this sounds like 3 cellos playing almost the same note but not quite, or if this sounds like one much fatter, much thicker cello. And so again, as I said, this is really a relatively limited electronic palette in terms of the kinds of processing that could be applied. There are much more dramatic, much more transformative electronics and processing that could be involved here. But I think you'll find that just with this much of a palette, I think Saariaho achieves quite a remarkable piece with quite a rich sound world. I think that's what I was hoping to say. I'm not convinced that there is a line, personally. I think that some of what historically made somewhat rigid boundaries between these sort of genre distinctions was rooted in the kinds of tools used and the kinds of tools available. And maybe as you're indicating, the increasing accessibility and, let's say, democratization of these tools means that I think some of those barriers disappear. So what we see on stage in what we call an electroacoustic music context, and what we might see on a very different stage in what is, in theory, a popular music context. In fact, sometimes the results, at least on the surface of things, are really quite similar. So this is, it's been a very transformative couple of decades as a result. And I think that our ideas of what music is and what genres are is transforming very rapidly as a result, I think.
Just to add to that, we've got a bit of like invisible sort of technology going through as well. You can't really see anything. You just see the microphone and then you hear the transformation. So we don't see any loop pedals, we don't see any equipment, you just hear change. So we sort of kept us sense of what's going on behind that laptop to just sort of get to hear the result.
And in this particular case, we've highlighted it a little bit by having me and the laptop on stage, but that isn't necessarily the case. A lot of the time, the laptop and the electronics performer are off stage, out of sight, leaving just the cellist with a couple of fairly unremarkable microphones, which gives, maybe really plays up this superhuman aspect to it.
So this is for the second piece in the program, which is by myself. It's another piece for cello and electronics. This piece is a little bit different because the electronics aren't sort of live in terms of taking a feed from the cellist. It's interesting because there's a little camera on the laptop which is picking up Jonathan's movements. So as he plays, there's sound, and if he's still, there's no sound. So you'll get to hear that in the second piece, but it's unrelated to the first one. Any other questions? Okay, great, thank you.
Thank you.